Thank you all so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I think I'd just like to tell a couple of stories about this work in context for me as an educator in Colorado and now as a legislator, and a little bit about the emotional connection between what we're trying to accomplish. And I'm excited for the question and answer, and I have spent the last 5 years in the legislature, and so are in the midst of a lot of these same struggles, both on standards, on assessments, on school funding and school finance, and so look forward to a conversation and a back and forth about this as we sit down to question and answer. I will say when the question of standards comes up, the first story that comes to mind for me is when I first took office as a senator 5 years ago. I represent the eastern half of Denver, which for us is the highest poverty district in the state of Colorado and has traditionally been the most violent district in the state of Colorado. So we have our most significant gang problems in Colorado are all based in my district. And so I don't know about you all, but in Colorado we don't have district offices. We just have an office at the Capitol. And so when I got elected, I decided in taking a book from some of the legislators who'd served before me in my district that what I would do with my resources instead of spending a bunch of time on yard signs because I was in a safe district was to try to open a community office. And so I opened this community office in the heart of one of our toughest gang-ridden neighborhoods that used to be a restaurant, and the guy that had the restaurant in the middle of the night ripped out all the restaurant supplies, put it on his truck, and took off. And so we had this sort of partially stripped down building that was a half restaurant, half former dentist's office. And so moved in with a couple of community nonprofits, and we were just about a week in, and it was, we were preparing to do a big moving in party. And on that Saturday, I was going to bring my kids over to the community office to help clean up, and there's a little front yard place where they like to play. And then last minute, my wife had to go to work, and I couldn't manage getting them all there, so just sort of took them out to the yard in front of our house instead and thought I'd go back later. And later that night, I get a call from the police, and they say, "Hey, Mike, we just want you to know there was a shooting at your community office, and we think everybody's okay, but you should probably come over and take a look at it." And so I come over and I go to sit with the commander to walk through the office. And out front of the office, there are 3 big bullet holes on the side of the office. And there was someone, they didn't care about us, there was someone coming by in a car shooting at the house across the street, and the house across the street shot back. And the 3 bullets come in right in that little playground where my kids like to come and hang out in the morning, where we would have come that morning if I could have gotten my act together to actually come over to the office. And I had never seen this before, but when you walk up to the site of a crime, the police mark each of the bullet holes. And I walk up to the side of my office, and there on the side of my office is a little A, a B, and a C for each bullet hole. And as I'm looking at these, I didn't know. I said, "What is this?" And one of the community members came by and said, "Yeah, those are the first ABCs the kids in our neighborhood see. Because they're the ones they're used to on the walk to and from school." I thought about in that moment both my fear of the risk I would have put my kids in if I had brought them to play in that space, and the reality of the fact that all the kids that lived next to my community office were walking to and from school every day in the midst of that risk every day, in the midst of that reality of the first A, B's, and C's you see in the morning may not be a book. They may actually be on the side of a building. And for me, it just called into relief the fact that if you look at the history of discrimination in this country, it has been fundamentally about 2 things. One is equity and access to resources, and the other is equity of expectations. Is the actual belief that that ought not to be every child's only exposure to the ABCs is that walk, but that danger certainly is reflected in the expectations of the kids and the neighbors and the schools. And what we were after in the debate about standards was finally, once and for all, to say, we believe there ought to be equity of expectations. There ought to be a belief that whatever ABCs you see on the way into school, the ABCs we expect you to master within that school remain the same. And I think this drives us to the much more controversial question of testing and what is the role now of testing in this conversation. I look back, if you look at 1926, when the SAT was first invented. There's a fascinating story on this in the Atlantic Monthly maybe 10 years ago. And the origin of the SAT was Ivy League schools on the East Coast had this radical idea that they wanted to diversify their population. They wanted not just the white guys from Andover and Exeter. They also wanted some white guys from Colorado and Illinois, if they could find them. But the problem was that was an incredibly risky proposition, because you knew the admission, you knew the headmaster at Andover, so you could always just call him and say, give me your 20 best guys, send them over to me. And there was no risk there. The notion that you could actually take a high school transcript from Andover and from Allentown or from Akron, Colorado with 40 kids in it and look at that 3.8 and make a real decision seemed impossible to any admissions counselor. 7 days a week, you pick the Andover kid over the Akron kid in that debate. So they said, what if you had actually some common metric that would allow us to identify the few decently smart people out in the other 37 states of the country if we wanted to bring some more white men out here? Hence was born the SAT. I joke about that. But when you look at the context of what the SAT has done in just the last 2 years, the SAT and the College Board has now started the strategy where one of the greatest losses they see is that what we call high-achieving, college-ready, low-income kids dramatically under-matriculate to universities. So kids who grow up on the south side of Chicago or the east side of Denver or the southern part of our state who are low-income but are 30s on the ACT or 1400s on the SAT, those kids are going to college at much lower rates and to much less competitive colleges than an upper-income kid is with the same 1400 score. So what are they doing now? Well, they're doing what anybody else would do, which is they're starting to gather that data in 9th grade as soon as they get a PSAT data, and they're immediately doing what, say, college recruiters have done for the last 50 years. When you heard about a kid that ran a 4.540 in the 9th grade, you send somebody out to take a look at him. So right now, what do? They send every one of those kids 4 immediate fee waivers to apply to any college they want. And now they're starting to get them information up front about their chances and their preparedness for college. They partnered with the state of Delaware on this. In 2 years, they went from somewhere around 20% of their college-ready low-income kids applying to college to 98%. Simply because they had the information to find these kids and say, we think you have a real opportunity, let us get you that information more quickly. And so the question of assessments is a question of how can you use data if you had it effectively? And the other thing is also true, right? I don't know about you, but I love sports. I love to watch the Olympics. I can't help the fact that every year when I watch the Olympics, I have to wait at the end of every night to check on the medal count, right? They do that little thing where he tells you, don't worry, right now America is at 47 and Russia is at 43. And I'm like, yes, okay, like, we're okay for one more night. Imagine how that moment would feel if Brian Williams, if he was still there, was telling us that the US was at 34th in the medal count, right below Ukraine. Right? Or Slovenia. There would be riots in the streets of Colorado Springs where the U.S. training ground is, I can tell you. And I don't think the response would be, well, you know what? The Olympics are really hard. Maybe the U.S. should just join the Pan Am Games, because the Pan Am Games aren't that hard. We could probably win that. I think instead you would see a dramatic and courageous and probably angry response to say, damn it, we're the best in the world at this. And until we show everyone else that we're the best in the world at this, we're not going to rest. Right? But I think that what we've seen in the conversation about education is a different one, is that somehow if we're not performing well, we should beat ourselves up about it, or we should just concede that that's always going to be the case, rather than feeling like we got sucker punched and said, all right, I'm going to remember the guy that did that, and I'm going to make sure I train and come back bigger and stronger and better and never lose this contest again. Right? And it just goes to what your expectation is. Our expectation has always been we win the medal count. Right? I mean, our expectation is that if you don't win the Super Bowl, John Fox, we can't keep you. The guy won 4 AFC West titles and got fired. Right? Because our expectation was not, we just want you to compete each year. We just want to be in the mix. And our expectation is if we don't win a Super Bowl, then don't come back. I think the question now is how do we use that data to be totally clear about demanding the same things out of our own kids and raising those expectations to match the place where we would expect of our kids, what we would expect of our best athletes. And so I think the fundamental challenge here is I think there is a belief that not telling someone that they're sick will make them well. And I don't know where that belief comes from. Because the notion that hiding that low performance or that injustice or that inequality is somehow helpful, I think is the most arrogant thing one can do. I think in my mind it probably borders on immoral, if not malpractice, right? Because the belief is, when would you ever say, I think for your own good, I probably shouldn't tell you that you're sick? When would you do that? You would do that if you knew they were dying and there was nothing you could do to stop it. Maybe. Maybe if my parent had a terminal illness and they've got 2 weeks left and you don't want her to worry about it for 2 weeks, you just say, you know what, let's just enjoy your last 2 weeks. If that's the judgment we're making about a third grader who's behind grade level, what we're saying is, you know what, baby, we're not going to bother telling you the bad news because frankly, there's nothing you can do to change it. And so you might as well just keep on doing what you're doing and not know that you're about to run into a buzzsaw. And here's the crazy part about it. What you're all envisioning is what I'm envisioning, right? Which is the kids in my district who are predominantly low-income black and brown kids who are making it to college and through at a 9% rate. Let me tell you this piece of data. You think of Colorado as a pretty white state, and it is. And you think of Colorado as probably a pretty well-educated state, and it is. What percentage of all kids in the state of Colorado, which are mostly white suburban kids, are, according to the ACT, ready for a 4-year college? What percentage of upper middle class white folks with parents with 2 or 3 degrees who think their kids are doing great, what percentage of those kids are going to go to University of Colorado at Boulder and not have to call mom and say, sorry mom, I got to take a remedial class in English? Only 25% of the state of Colorado is college ready. There's a whole lot of white folks in that category. A whole lot of middle class folks in that category. But there is a belief that some of the strongest places where we see the opt-out movement are coming from those communities, where they're very satisfied with the existing social strata that puts their community where it is. If you tell some hard truths about actually how prepared those kids are to compete, not just with kids around the state, but kids around the globe, it paints a much tougher picture. I, for one, would want to know that hard truth, and would want to know it as early as possible so I could do something about it. I think that's the question that awaits us on assessments. I'll say one thing about school finance, because I spent about 2 years of my life on this one and made a lot of mistakes I can help you avoid, hopefully. Which is to say, this equity issue of opportunity matters if you create a system that has equity of financing. And if you say we believe a couple things. One is we believe that our system ought to be accountable for the impact of public dollars that we spend. We ought to know where every dollar goes, and we ought to know what outcomes we get for that dollar. Which means, as a teacher, it helps you identify, if I got 3 classrooms, one's doing a fantastic job and 2 aren't, I'd love to know what's working in that one classroom so I can share it with the 2 that aren't. If I have schools or systems or districts that are making fantastic investments with the same dollars and getting breakthrough results, we want to know exactly how they spent those dollars so they can build a map for us to all get better. And then I think in addition to that, you want to say, and we want to build into the formula a system that says we want you, educators and communities, to prioritize most the kids who need you the most. Which means we ought to build a system like the one that we tried to build in Colorado that says the higher the needs of a student, the more the dollar signs that walk in that door with that student. Because I will tell you, as a former principal, you get every time in November or December the kid who walks in the door to register for the first time. You know, he's been hanging out for 3 months. And I can tell you in Colorado, the first sign he's a troublemaker is that kid is always wearing a Raiders jersey. Always. That is the one sort of profiling that I always endorse. And your incentive as a school leader is if you take that kid who's 3 months behind, hasn't done a lick of work, is probably an attendance challenge, you are going to get, if any money at all, if he comes after the October count date. If you all have a single count date like we do, you get nothing if he comes October 3rd or beyond. But even if you do, you're going to get the same amount to support that student who is first-generation immigrant, undocumented, non-native English speaker, 3 grade levels behind, as I'm going to get for the student that comes in 3 grade levels ahead. What rational actor in a system doesn't in their gut, even if they don't want to acknowledge it in their heart, see those 2 kids walking in the door and think, wow, I should tell that kid in the Raiders jersey about this great high school down the road. He would really do well. What you want is the opposite system, which is when Raiders walks in the door, I think, oh, this kid's going to be tough. Maybe, but this kid's going to come with all of the resources my team actually needs to support him. Then you create a system where you got folks trolling the 16th Street Mall, finding kids with Raiders jerseys to put them into school, instead of trying to send them out of school. So I think that is a deep change in human behavior you can drive through something as unsexy as a school finance formula. I'll close with this story. So there is, I have long days in this work, as I'm sure that you do. And when I do, I go back to touchstones for me of the legacies that I hope I inherit, of the work that I hope I'm finishing, of the footsteps that I hope I'm following in. And for me, that guidebook is often the civil rights movement, an example of a movement that set really ambitious goals about what justice looked like and found ways against the odds to succeed at them. And here's the short story I'll tell. The history teachers in the crowd will know this, but I didn't. It's a story that we all know about the bus boycott, except for there is a gap between the perception of the story and the reality of the story, which is the perception of the story is Rosa Parks refuses to sit down. She is this sort of innocent elderly woman who is not complicit in the plan when in fact she was deeply a part of it. Dr. King stands up and gives a speech, and the segregated bus system collapses. Right? That's the 30-second historical narrative. The reality of the story is when the bus boycott was originally planned, the boycott was planned for one day. And after a very successful one day, they all came back to the church and said, wow, that was great, what do we do next? And for the school administrators in the room, like imagining living one day without buses is terrifying enough, not to mention an entire year. And in that conversation, people are arguing back and forth, and there is a woman standing in the back of the church who raises her hand and says, excuse me. And they call on her, and she says, hey, her name is Mary Jo Smiley. And Mary Jo Smiley says, I just want to say that I have a car. And whoever's running the meeting says, thank you, that's very cute. We're trying to solve problems here. That's not what we're talking about. And she says, no, I have a car, and I would be willing to take 10 people every day to and from work. All of a sudden, the room stops. Well, who else has a car? We get groups of 10 opening up around the room. Someone has taxis that they can help with. All of a sudden, there's a plan to say, what if we could actually execute on getting these 10 people? This is 1955. There is no, I'm going to order my groceries online or do my banking online. This is getting you to grandma's house, to the laundromat, to the bank, to your cousins, all of it. And so they build a plan. The next day, Mary Jo Smiley goes, picks up 10 people, gets them to work, gets them home. She does it on day 5 and day 10 and day 30 and day 50. And around day 60, her boss gets furious that they can't break this insurgency, and so they find out that Mary Jo's a part of it, and they fire her. She loses her job. Day 51, picks up her 10 people, gets them to work, and gets them home. And on day 60 and day 100 and day 150, and around day 150, the fury is so great now that they're not willing to satisfy for getting her fired. So they arrest her. They arrest Mary Jo Smiley and put her in jail for, I don't know what, conspiracy to commit equality, I suppose. They put her in jail, and the leaders of the movement now find out this poor little woman in the back of the room who raised her hand is in jail. And they speed down to the jail, pay her bail, get her out, apologize, we're so sorry, we never meant to happen, please go home. And as they're talking, she says, stop. Where are my keys? I got 10 people, I got to get to work. And the next day, she gets up and gets her 10 people to work and home. And on day 200 and 250 and 300 and 350 and 378, until finally the system says, we give up. We break. And I tell you that not just because it is an example of the way that dramatic change happens, which is not in the one historic speech that we give in the front of the room, but in the deep commitment to execution and implementation along the way, but also in a world that has relentlessly clear metrics about what we want to accomplish and an explicit way to know how we're doing on that every day. It was very clear for Mary Jo Smiley. I got 10 folks. I got to get them from here to work and home, and I got to get them there every day until the work is done. In the same way that the teachers in this classroom have 30 or 130 or 180 kids, they have to get from here to there and home every day until the work is done. I would argue that if we are going to make a push for educational equity and not demand that we know how our kids are doing along the way, it is only a move to get us from slavery to Jim Crow. It is only a move to get us to say, okay, we won't say you can't vote anymore. We'll just make sure you never have the information you need to know how to vote. We'll say you can go to school anywhere you want now, but we'll make sure you never have the information you need to know what your kid actually needs to succeed. That is not a system that is built for success. But if you believe in the old promise that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that promise requires us to build a system that actually views kids that way. I think that's the work that you're in right now, and it's not going to get easier, it's going to get harder. But at the end of that outcome is the possibility to actually deliver something no one else has ever delivered, which is a place where a kindergartner in every one of your districts is going to walk into kindergarten with the same chance that 13 years later she's going to walk out with a cap and gown on her head, a chance to go to college, a chance to support a middle-class family. That is what they meant when they said we hold these truths to be self-evident. Thanks so much for having me.